Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, a podcast that aims to provide valuable information to young saxophonists and music students in a digestible amount of time. I'm Owen Robinson, and today I will be interviewing Professor Zachary Shemon, Professor of Saxophone at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Professor Shemon, it's great to have you on the show today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So the first question I wanted to ask you today has to do with maintaining a good sound, a consistent sound. So even seasoned professional saxophonists have various hurdles to overcome when it comes to maintaining a rich, even sound. The biggest hurdle, many would agree, would probably be reeds. How do you maintain your sound and take care of your reeds, and how have your approaches to these things changed over the course of your career?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would definitely agree that reed care and maintenance, and for me, the break-in process is a huge element to maintaining my sound. And also, to be honest, just my mental health going into performances. Thinking back to some of the major performances I've had throughout my career, when I walk off stage, the feeling I had, whether it's a positive or a negative feeling, oftentimes is related to how well my reed performed for me that day. And so my focus with reed care and specifically the break-in process is just to find stability with my reeds and predictability with my reeds. And we could probably have a whole podcast episode dedicated to my specific break-in process and all of that. I can maybe offer a few insights, but more broadly, what I try to emphasize to my students is finding a process that works for you and works for your needs. For example, I'm in Kansas City, Missouri right now, where the temperature is over the last couple of weeks gone up and the humidity's gone up. And so my reeds need different things now than they did, say, in February when it was in the single digits and super low humidity. And so somebody might be listening in Louisiana who has very different needs than somebody who might be in Canada, for example. So just to give you an idea of some of the things I think about with my reed break-in process, first thing is how long I soak my reeds. So when I open a box of reeds, how long do you soak it for? And the thing to answer the question about how this has changed throughout the course of my career is I would say I'm more scientific about it now, or maybe that's not the right word, but I'm more precise with how I measure these things. So I literally have a stopwatch up on my stand and I time how long I soak my reeds. And I soak them in water. If I'm at home, I just take a bowl from the cupboard, or if I'm on the road or even just at school, I have Tupperware that's the size of a reed, and I have a timer up, and I soak my reeds for between 1 and 3 minutes, never less than 1 minute, never more than 3 minutes, and that's dependent on the season. So in the winter time, it's more in that 2 to 3 minute range. In the summertime, it's more in the 1 to 2 minute range, just because it's so much more humid. The ambient humidity is so much higher. And when I break in reeds, I start by just playing on them just a couple minutes. The first day, I play on all of them for 1 or 2 minutes. So that means I might soak it for 2 minutes, play on it for 2 minutes, and then I let it rest for a couple minutes. So I'm not putting it away wet. And then I store it in a humidity controlled environment. And so for me, I use those humidity packs, and I prefer around a 49% humidity. That's just me. But again, that can be dependent on the season or just what part of the world you live in. But for me, I like to store my reeds kind of in that 45 to 55% humidity range. If I put them away wet, or if I store them too wet, what I find is they come out of the box or come out of the case the next day with less flexibility. They feel harder, but they don't give you the qualities that you like in a harder reed. They're just kind of less flexible. So those are just a couple of the things that I do, but I think the thing that I would emphasize is finding a system that works for you. I play on D'Addario Reserve reeds on alto, and I find that the break-in process for me is quite extended. So I'll take between 2 and 4 weeks of slowly ramping up the amount of time that I'm playing on a reed before I feel like it's ready. And if I do that stretched out break-in process over the course of, say, a month, I find that those reeds are much more stable and they last for a long time. So the life of my reed can be several months, as long as even a year or two. But again, that will vary depending on the reeds that you're playing on. Also, I have students who play on synthetic reeds, and that's a whole other thing. And so this past semester, I did actually I did a whole studio class on my reed break-in process and storage and all of that. And then the next week I had my students present on synthetic reeds because they're much more knowledgeable and experienced in that area. So I think the key is just to try some things and document it and be precise about however long you might be soaking it or how long you're playing it or what humidity you're storing it in. Keep track of those things, and you can make micro adjustments along the way and find something that works really well for you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great answer. I've seen a number of presentations on reed break-in processes and talk to various teachers about like how they break in their reeds, and some soak their reeds, some don't, but it's all seems very similar to your process in that they have a pretty well-defined set of parameters for how they do it, and they also increase the amount of time that they're playing the reed. It takes a number of weeks before they feel that a reed is ready to play. Yeah, that's interesting too. I think as a young player, sometimes I am not totally sure what reed strength or cut or brand that I really prefer. So I'll try different things, and I'm not entirely sure what I need yet as a player. Sometimes I'll buy a box of reeds and I really need reeds that play, so I'll overplay the ones that play well, and then they die too soon. So definitely breaking in reeds is something I'm still very much working on.
Yeah, and the break-in process can be cumbersome, right? Because it disrupts your practice sessions. And that's the other thing that I've tried to incorporate into my practicing is if I'm in a reed break-in phase, I try to find things that I can work on during that phase, because there's a lot of time spent soaking and putting reeds away and all of that. It eats up a big chunk of the practice session. And so what I try to do is I try to do my reed break-in phase separately from when I have a lot of performances. And so it's usually maybe in the summer months before the semester begins, or maybe on a break between semesters. Those are good times for me to break in a lot of reeds that hopefully will have stability during the busier concert season.
Yeah, that's great to know as well. I think I've especially noticed if I get into a place during busier parts of the year, like in the middle of the semester where I need new reeds, it's much harder to break in reeds when I'm trying to really focus on repertoire or specific like technical assignments. Also, as far as long tones, scales, technical exercises, are there any things in particular that you do specifically focusing on tone in your practice session?
Yeah, my work on tone starts with work on the neck. And this is something during grad school I can't tell you the number of hours I spent just playing on the neck and just trying to find a focus in my sound and a purity in the sound and a response that's immediate. And once I'm happy with my sound, and only once I'm happy with my sound of the neck, then I go to the saxophone and I put the neck on an alto, I put the neck on the horn, and I play that same concert A flat on the alto saxophone. And I try to imitate, or I try to recreate that sound I was happy with on the neck. And then I move up and down from there, and half step up, half step down, whole step up, whole step down. And I use that neck sound, and then that becomes the concert A flat on the saxophone as the model. And I try to match that up and down the horn. And then the next step would be to match that up and down the horn at various dynamic levels, match that up and down the horn, various dynamic levels, plus articulation, or plus vibrato, or plus a tuner, or a drone in some capacity. So I'm not big on just long tones, but I like to do variations on long tones where there are multiple parameters that we're thinking about at once, whether it's articulation or pitch or vibrato or dynamics, or even just timbre. Maybe there's not a one size fits all sound, like, oh, this is my ideal sound. Well, the sound really needs to match the character of the music. So trying to develop a palette available to me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I've talked to multiple, graduate students, teachers who like to do work on the neck and also like just the mouthpiece, working on like flexibility with the mouthpiece. They'll like match pitch with a piano, like descending chromatically, things like that. But that's interesting that you bring up your approach to like long tones, quote unquote long tones, is like more of an applied approach, not just like doing long tones, but what is this going to accomplish? How is this going to improve my sound? That's really interesting. Definitely something I'd like to try, especially during the summer when I'll have ample time to just think about these things and work on these things. To my next question, which is kind of related to tone, it's easy to lose sight of just how much air pressure it takes to play the saxophone well. Are there any exercises that you incorporate into your practice routine to practice good air support?
Well, again, another huge topic that we could probably have a whole podcast episode on. And there are so many great resources out there on this topic that I don't necessarily need to get into those specifically. I don't think, because like I said, there are resources available to help you develop your lung capacity or exercises, breathing exercises, and then also not just how much air you can intake, but how much pressure you can use as you exhale. But maybe to just give you a different perspective on my approach is the thing I think about is how efficiently I can use my air. And that's not to diminish the importance of doing breathing exercises or developing your lung capacity. And I can certainly talk about some of the things I do personally to develop stamina to get through long concerts. But I think the starting point for me goes back to those neck exercises that I was talking about, where I start on the neck and I set my embouchure and I set my jaw pressure and I set my tongue position or my voicing position, if you want to call it that. And I want the neck to be able to respond with as little air as possible. So it's sort of like the opposite of what you might think, or oftentimes what teachers tell students. You need to use more air, more air, more air. I think about how little air can I use and still get the neck to respond, because everything else is in place. And there are a lot of things that need to be in place. You have to have a mouthpiece that has a flat table probably, and that is balanced. You have to have a reed that's not warped, that's sealing to that mouthpiece. You have to have a good ligature that's holding the reed onto the mouthpiece. And then you have to have developed that kind of control with your embouchure and your jaw pressure and an understanding of where your tongue position needs to be to get that kind of niente attack on the neck or any other note on the saxophone. But that's my starting point, is getting the instrument to respond with as little air as possible. And if I can find that kind of efficiency, then that efficiency remains there as I ramp up to higher dynamic levels. And that allows me to play longer phrases or allows me to play at louder dynamics. So I think that's something that's important to consider too. So to use an analogy, it would be like a car. One factor is, of course, how big the gas tank is, but probably the bigger factor is the miles per gallon that you're getting. So you don't require as big of a gas tank, or if you have a bigger gas tank, that will take you further. So that's just another way to think of air. And I would say it becomes a bigger factor maybe when you're playing the bigger instruments, like if you're playing a lot of baritone saxophone or bass saxophone, perhaps you're finding more instances where you're running out of breath. But on soprano, alto, tenor, I don't find that my lung capacity is typically a limiter for me. And rather the limiter is if I have a reed that's warped and I'm struggling to get it to respond. Usually those are the cases where I'm running out of air or unhappy with my air support. So that's just another way to think of it.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and I completely agree with the comment on reeds, the warped reeds. Any kind of problem with a reed can be, like I said, a barrier to getting a good sound. It's like if you have a bad reed, it's all that practice kind of doesn't help you, which is why reeds can be so frustrating, I think, especially for young players. And I've definitely, especially on tenor, because I play a lot of tenor. I play tenor and quartet, and I find that cane reeds on tenor can give me a lot of issues. They like warp easily. I've heard because there's a bigger surface area that the larger reeds often will warp more easily. And I've had a lot of trouble getting cane reeds to play well on tenor. So I've played many hours on synthetic reeds and found success, but I'm actually finding that I'm going back to cane reeds again and just really trying to take more time and better care of them. But yes, definitely if it's too hard of a reed or if the reed is warped, I find that even if I feel that I have a good level of energy and I'm well prepared when I go up to the instrument, I don't sound the way I want to. I run out of air, things like that. It can be very frustrating.
It's also something to think about as a teacher when you hear a young player. Let's say you have a young student who plays and they have a really small, thin sound. Oftentimes, the first piece of advice that a teacher might offer that student is to use more air, which is not a bad piece of advice, but oftentimes there's some other factor going on there. Like perhaps they're not taking in enough mouthpiece, or perhaps their reed is a little bit too soft, or perhaps the reed is warped. There are often a lot of other factors, and you can, of course, use more air, and that always helps. But there are other factors at play, and I mean, I suppose that if you use more air, that will immediately solve it. But there are other issues that you probably want to address along the way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, especially in the saxophone world, there are all these innovations in instrument technology and gear. Some people are very interested in their setup and make changes often, and then some people I've met are not very interested in their setup. They say like it's completely about the player. That doesn't have to do with what necessarily equipment you're playing on. And I feel that I'm somewhere in between, because I've really come to value the importance of practice and study, but also if things aren't comfortable, if things aren't the way you want them when you set up your instrument, then that can be a huge hindrance to your practice session. Like you mentioned, if you maybe don't have the right mouthpiece, if the table isn't flat, or if your reed is warped, that's going to be a huge barrier to having a productive practice session and quite simply sounding good. Yeah, so that's really an interesting topic. As you know, saxophonists could talk for hours about this very thing, just mouthpieces, reeds alone.
It's fun. It's often fun to talk about gear, but honestly, when you think about the gear, like I would rather have a student model saxophone that seals perfectly than, the fanciest gold-plated whatever model. If it has one leak, all of a sudden it's going to make your life that much harder. So I think it's important to focus on the right things, and it's easy to kind of be distracted by shiny objects or the latest thing. But in reality, the simplest things make the biggest difference. So the reed, nobody will know what reed you're playing on when they just watch you play. They don't know if you're playing on, a cane reed, a synthetic reed, what strength it is. But it's actually the most important element of any of your equipment is probably that reed. Second most important thing would either be like the mouthpiece or whether your horn is sealing. So these are things that you can't really see from a distance. But of course, we love talking about all the smaller things too, because it's fun. But those are the icing on the cake.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's like, depending on what audience you're playing for, if they're not saxophonists, they don't know what saxophone you're playing on. They don't know what mouthpiece you have and what reed you have. But they can hear how you sound. They can hear if there's air in the sound, if you have a leak in the instrument. Those are the really, I think, important things is, when you get on that stage, that everything is working properly and that you're prepared. It doesn't really matter if you have a Yamaha or a Selmer or what model. Then nobody really cares about that.
Right.
When it really comes down to the wire. My next question is one that I am going to ask in every episode of this podcast, and it's from a teacher's perspective, how do you strike the balance between encouragement and criticism while helping students reach their full potential as an artist?
Yeah, that's something we deal with all the time as teachers, and striking that balance is important. And I think having that relationship between a student and a teacher is really special. And you kind of develop this trust where you trust that your teacher is giving you the feedback that's appropriate, and your teacher is there to encourage you and to help you reach your goals. And they're also there to tell you what needs work and give you the feedback that you need so that you can improve. So there's this constant balance of working on those two things, or thinking about those two things and the feedback that we offer students. One framework that I sometimes use, or an analogy that I use, is to think of an hourglass shape. And this is something I picked up from Otis Murphy, who was my teacher when I was a student at Indiana University. And he talks about the hourglass shape as you prepare music, where it starts in kind of a broad, like you hear the piece for the first time and you have an impression of the piece, and you work your way more narrow into the center of the hourglass, working on specific details. Then as you get closer to the performance, you become more broad again. And you can think of that same process happening with a student and a teacher, where when you start off with a student, so let's say I have a graduate student who's doing a master's degree. I might meet them when they audition for me and they have a lesson, and we talk about their goals and we talk about their dreams. And that conversation carries into maybe when they start their degree. At that point, I'm primarily interested in encouraging them, and I want them to tell me my dreams so that I can help provide a path for them, a path forward that they can follow. And if anything, my job is to ask them to dream bigger and imagine, even bigger things that they might do, and then help provide them a path week to week where they can work towards those dreams and work towards those goals. Now, as we get into the specifics, that's where we narrow down into the center of the hourglass. That's sort of the week to week lessons. That's the day-to-day practice sessions that these students have. And that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, and things can become difficult. They can become challenging. And that's where I think it's our job as teachers to hold our students to a high level so that they can reach their potential, and let them know if they're falling short of what we perceive their potential to be. And then when we get to the end of that process, let's say it's their final degree recital, at that point, again, it shifts primarily back to encouragement and celebrating all the work that they've done over the course of their preparation for the recital. So there's always a little bit of both. I think as a student, you're always looking for critique from your teacher so that you can continue to improve. But you're also relying on them for encouragement. And that was often the things that inspired me as a student, were little things that my teacher maybe didn't even know that they said or did. But I remember I studied with Donald Cinta in my undergrad and in my master's, and sometimes I would just run into him in the hall, and he would say something to me that would just kind of like spark an energy that would inspire me to want to go practice and work hard. And usually it was some kind of encouragement, some kind of praise about something that I was doing. So always keeping that in balance is important, I think, for that student-teacher relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, as a student, that's always something that I remember those moments. Now, I'd like to kind of move on to just some more general questions. The first one is, what is the weirdest, most unique thing that you do to prepare for a performance?
Well, my preparation for a performance, I'm not sure if it's weird, but maybe it's unique. I'm not sure. It's, if anything, maybe a little bit boring. But one thing that I think about leading up to a performance is just the importance of sleep and healthy eating habits and just healthy lifestyle habits in general. And some of this has been informed by, I do a lot of like running and triathlon races. And so with these races, oftentimes you start at 7 a.m. And so the preparation begins several days ahead of time, because oftentimes you can't sleep very well the night before a race, and you might be able to relate the night before a big performance. Maybe you don't sleep very well and you feel like, I didn't get a good night's sleep, I'm not going to have a good performance. When in reality, it's the 2 nights before that you really need a good night's sleep. And in fact, it's the whole week leading up to a performance that you have to have a good night's sleep. So that's something I try to prioritize, is getting good, consistent sleep, which for me means consistent bedtime and consistent wake time, and trying to get a full 8 hours sleep for several days leading up to a performance. And then the same thing with kind of what I'm eating. Like the main things I try to watch out for would be caffeine intake, and also sugar or carbohydrate intake the day of a performance. And it's something that I've noticed can really impact my energy level in general throughout the day, but especially on the day of a performance. And we find ourselves sometimes performing at various hours. Most recently, I played with the ballet in Kansas City, and we would have 7:30 p.m. shows that would go from 7:30 until 10 p.m. And then the next day we'd have a 2 p.m. matinee. And so you have to be prepared for all those scenarios and know kind of what you're going to need to do to prepare your body to have even energy. So in general, I tend to be someone who, if I'm going to have caffeine, I try to have it in the form of green tea because I know that that offers me more stable energy. I find sometimes I love dark chocolate, and there's caffeine in that. You have to kind of be careful. So just moderating that. So on the day of a performance, I try not to do too much caffeine, especially early in the day, because I don't want to crash leading into the performance. But sometimes you need kind of that little spark of focus going into a performance. So sometimes I'll have a cup of green tea or a couple squares of dark chocolate half hour before the performance, just to kind of stimulate the brain and give me that focus that I need. So sleep and eating habits are the two things that I think about a lot leading up to performances.
That's a great answer. Thank you. So here's a very general question. Just what do you like to do outside of music? I know you mentioned running, triathlons, various athletic activities.
Yeah, that's my main interest, honestly, outside of saxophone. It's something that I developed in grad school at a point when I felt myself veering towards burnout. Um, and if there are any grad students listening, you might be able to relate to this feeling. It was during a time when I was competing in a lot of competitions and I had a lot of academic responsibilities and a lot of recitals that I was preparing for. And I felt like my whole life was just saxophone in school and I needed something else. And so I started running, and this was I started exercising more regularly, first of all, and I think that helped just kind of even out my energy levels and just kind of balance my life out. Prior to that, I was trying to practice as much as I could. So if I could practice 4 or 5, 6 hours a day, that was a really successful day. And I found that after about that third hour, maybe the fourth hour, it was kind of wasted time. It was diminishing returns in the practice room. And so when I kind of balanced my life out more and prioritized exercising, I found that I could practice less, but still get as much done, and I have better focus, and just really changed my life in a lot of ways. So got into exercising and running. I ran my first marathon in 2011 when I was in grad school. And I still do that to this day. I've run, I think 9 marathons at this point. I ran the Boston Marathon this past April. That was the most recent race that I did. But that also led me into triathlon, which I'm thankful for that I got into that, because running alone can kind of beat up your body. And I've started to face that as I get older. My hips don't like all the wear and tear from just running. And so balancing that out with biking and swimming allows me to stay active, but with a little bit less wear and tear on the body. And so I would say that's actually, I kind of alternate between really focusing on running and running races and then going to triathlon. But I've done running races from 5Ks to marathons, and triathlons from sprint to Olympic to half Ironman. To the last triathlon I did was a full Ironman in November. I did Ironman Arizona. That was my 4th full Ironman that I've done, and it becomes kind of part of your lifestyle. So there's oftentimes not room for a lot of interest outside of what you do professionally, and then something like triathlon, because it's 3 sports plus all of the kind of nutrition needs that go into it, and physical therapy that go into it. But outside of that, I like taking the puppy for walks. My wife and I love going on walks and hikes with our puppy, and that's probably about it.
Oh yeah. I have a dog myself. He's a mixed breed. He's Cocker Spaniel, Shih Tzu, and Yorkie mainly. What kind of dog do you have?
He's an Australian Labradoodle, so it's Cocker Spaniel, Labrador, and Poodle.
Awesome. How old?
He is about 1.5 years old.
Okay, yeah, so definitely a puppy. That's great.
Yeah, he's starting to show signs of maturity where we can leave him out for periods of time and he doesn't like completely destroy the house.
Right. Yeah. It's always a process with dogs. We had a couple Scottish Terriers when I was younger, and it takes a while before you can really trust the dog to just kind of be alone in the house. Yeah, that's great. I'm definitely not a runner at all. I have never enjoyed running, but I do. I swam for a long time when I was younger, and that's helped me a lot since I've gone away to school, especially in the winter. When you're spending so much time in a basement practice room, it's been really helpful to be able to go to the pool and do cardio or go to the gym and lift weights. it's made a huge difference in my ability to focus. I always love talking to people about, what they do outside of saxophone, because it's super important. My professor, Joe Luloff at MSU, he's very into weightlifting. He goes for long walks, and he, it's really become a big part of his life and really changed some of the ways he looks, I think, at music. And a lot of, the graduate students in my studio, some are runners, some lift weights very regularly, and it does show. They seem very healthy, and they are very focused on the instrument, on music. That's always a great thing to see.
Different motivation for these activities at various stages of your life or your career. I think, when you're younger, oftentimes you're working out for vanity, maybe. At various stages, you have other motivations. For me, it's really, it's fun to track the progress and see, even in my late 30s, I'm having some of the fastest race times of my life. So I feel like I'm in better shape now than I was when I was in my 20s. But then you see someone like Professor Luloff, who's having this career, well into middle age, and he sounds better every time I hear him. And I think a big part of that is just maintaining physical health, and developing those habits early on can be helpful, because once you become kind of in middle age, at that point, sometimes at that point you're thinking about dealing with injuries, and it's better to just try to stay ahead of that. So weight training especially can be really helpful. Weight training and stretching and things like yoga, those things can be really great for your physical and mental health, but also it can be great for just getting ahead of injuries and trying to prevent injuries, because we all will face them at some point in our career. And as much as you can get ahead of it, the better it is. And it's great to have role models like Professor Luloff, who's kind of leading the way and showing us how we can have a long, successful career.
Thank you for listening. This concludes episode 2 of The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, featuring special guest, Professor Zachary Shemon, professor of saxophone at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. The music you heard in this episode was composed by Dorothy Chang, performed by Zachary Costello, alto saxophone, and Guillaume Ra, piano. I'm Owen Robinson, and this has been The Well-Rounded Saxophonist. Thank you for listening, and until next time, remember to practice smart and stay healthy.